People think about Galveston's history as a number of special and big events that we know about: the Great Storm, the Great Raising, the Civil War, whatever it might be. But really, Galveston is made up of people, individuals who came to Galveston, explored the island, lived here, made their fortunes here. And we like to tell that part of it so that you can really begin to understand what's behind those history. It's the people, the men and women who made Galveston what it is today.
Archibald MacCallum was a Scottish immigrant. He was born in 1881 to a pretty well-to-do family in Scotland. His dad was an attorney. And Archibald MacCallum was sort of set up to live that kind of life in Scotland, but once he got done with college at the University of Edinburgh, he decided kind of on a whim to move to New York. He heard that he could get a job there with a company called the Commercial Cable Company. And after 7 years working in New York, he transferred to a different company, the Mexican Telegraph Company. The Mexican Telegraph Company had a monopoly on all of the traffic that would be going from anywhere in the U.S. to Mexico and even further south. If something was going to Brazil or Argentina, it would all have to go through these lines. And one of the headquarters of the company was here in Galveston. MacCallum lived on Post Office Street, and he would have been about 5 blocks from his office on the Strand. And that's where he would have been working from day to day, receiving these messages and then sending them on to Central and South America. But in the midst of all that, he would have been making a lot of runs to the shed that was on the seawall, which is now standing behind me because it was relocated in the 1990s. Now, about 1917, unbeknownst to Archibald MacCallum, one of the messages that they received was the Zimmerman telegram.
Arthur Zimmerman was the German Foreign Secretary at the time while all this happened. So they, in early 1917, the German Foreign Office assumes that American intervention is just a question of time, and they start thinking about ways how they could counterbalance America's intervention. Zimmerman, or one of his associates, comes up with this idea of an alliance offer to Mexico. And essentially this alliance officer said to the Mexicans, if the United States declares war against Germany, we'll make you an alliance offer, you declare war on the United States, and they had to put some sort of incentive in there, right? I mean, they couldn't just assume that the Mexicans would attack America because they liked the Germans so much. So the Germans put this notorious provision, and this is what the Zimmerman telegram really becomes infamous for, of German support for the Mexican reconquest of New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas, including Galveston. The Germans encrypt the telegram, and that was normal procedure. So it's basically, it's cipher groups. You know, it's like 5-digit numbers. So if you don't have the code, you don't know what this is. And the Americans then transmit this to Washington. You can follow the route of the telegram here on the screen. So it goes from the American Embassy in Berlin to the American Embassy in Copenhagen. Denmark was neutral at the time. From Copenhagen, it goes to the American Embassy in London. From there, it goes to the State Department. The State Department then gives the telegram to the German ambassador in Washington. He deciphers it, he understands, oh, this is not for me, this is for my colleague in Mexico City. And then he goes to the offices of the Western Union, and he sends it via Galveston.
But some British intelligence officers were actually eavesdropping on the American diplomatic cables. So they got the message, they kind of recognized what it was, they decrypted it, and then realized this is a pretty bad-looking thing for the German government to be involved in, and the Americans probably wouldn't appreciate this very much. So they don't want America to know that they've been listening in on these cables, so they concoct a different story. They say that they bribed a Mexican telegraph company agent in Mexico City.
Make a long story short, on March 1st, 1917, virtually every major American newspaper carries the news of the Zimmerman telegram. This is the New York Times, but most papers will have looked very similarly on March 1st, 1917, and that brings us to the question, well then, what now is the effect of the Zimmerman telegram? The US government was already well on its way to going to war. I think you could make the point that the Zimmerman telegram accelerated this process. Wilson himself, you know, he was an interesting guy. I mean, he did take things very personally, and you know, when he reads this, and he understands, you know, he was still hoping to negotiate with the Germans, and here the Germans preparing for war.
A lot of people join up for the service because they feel like Germany has gone too far. One of the people who signs up is Archibald MacCallum. Those like MacCallum who had training in the telegraph service, there was a huge need because they knew that that kind of communication was going to be a necessity during the war. So they made posters like this one that they put out for anybody who already had that training to come serve in the U.S. Army. And even someone like MacCallum, who was not naturally born American citizen, obviously heard this call and felt that it was important to go serve his adopted country. So he served overseas for about 2 years, from the summer of 1917 until the end of the war in 1919. He comes back, he lives in Galveston for the rest of his life with his wife and children. He gets a job at the Mexican Telegraph Company again as sort of their manager until that office closed in the late 40s. And the whole time he may have died not knowing exactly how close he was to this whole thing, because research, the files weren't unclassified until much later in the 20th century, and that's when people really understood exactly how this telegram had made its way from Berlin to Mexico City.